Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Jeff-Ando. I'm a director at Global Trade Review, and on behalf of the Coriolis team, it's my pleasure to be hosting this webinar session as part of this week's Future of Strategy 2021 virtual event. We've got a formidable lineup of experts eager to share their knowledge during this next hour, focused on the importance of accelerating legal reform to enable digital and paperless trade. A quick spot of housekeeping, please do use the Q&A function. We'll look to make this session as interactive as possible and to get to your questions as part of this discussion. Our plan is to make this a free-flowing conversation, while we'll also strive for some concrete action points at the end, which I know is very much in line with Rebecca and the team's mandate for this week. Firstly, however, I'd like to ask our speakers to introduce themselves, though many of them, I'm sure, need no introduction. Perhaps I could start with you, Chris.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon. Hello, everybody. My name is Chris Southworth. I'm the Secretary General of the ICC, International Chamber of Commerce here in the UK, and also the co-chair of the B2B cluster at the Commonwealth Connectivity Agenda.
Fantastic. Oswald?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. My name is Oswald Kuyler. I'm the Managing Director of the Digital Standards Initiative based out of Singapore.
Great. And Craig?
Yes, good morning to everybody. My name is Craig Burchell. I'm a trade lawyer of 30 years standing, and I spent 20 years at Philips as their chief trade lawyer. And since 2018, I've been advising Huawei on their trade policy issues.
Fantastic. And Sean?
Hi, everybody. Another lawyer, I'm afraid. I'm two jobs. My main job is as head of legal at Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation. But I'm on here principally in my other role as chair of the ITFA.
And Niels.
Yeah, thanks. Excuse me. Thanks, Jeff, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. My name is Niels Strazdins, trade specialist with the Commonwealth Secretariat, and as part of the Secretariat's connectivity agenda section, I lead on projects and initiatives to modernize and increase Commonwealth trade and investment, as well as to advance private sector engagement in our trade activities.
Fantastic. We've also got Rebecca here, who's here to provide input on challenges, data and outcomes as required. And as we know, Coriolis has carried out some work on the business cases for the reform, which also means we don't have a manual as well, which is always good. Now, I don't think I'm overstating the case in saying that this is a huge topic and one that strikes the very heart of the present priorities for global trade growth. A recent report by the ICC estimated that trade across the G7 countries could increase by an eye-watering $9 trillion in the next 5 years if the industry reaches full digitisation. It also says that if the G7 can achieve the legal reform, standardisation and adoption of digital records that various ministers committed to earlier in May, trade would climb by nearly 50% from its figures in 2019 by 2026. So these are huge numbers. Chris? There was an ICC report, ICC report, should I say. It makes most sense to start with you on this one. You've been instrumental in this process and a champion for the work of the UN Commission on International Trade Law and the adoption of its model law on electronic transferable records, which gives electronic trade documents, such as the ill bill of lading, the same legal standing as their paper-based counterparts. 6 months on from that meeting of May, where are we in this process in your view, and do you maintain the same confidence you had when you said this was a breakthrough at a transformational step and urged exporters to get ready to embrace digital?
Yeah, we should just remind for those that are new to this, there are two barriers to the growth of digital trade worldwide. And the first barrier is lack of or legal fragmentation. Every jurisdiction has its own legal infrastructure, and that legal infrastructure is not harmonized. So, and that doesn't allow us to scale solutions into markets. So that's the first barrier. And the second barrier is we don't have, or there's an absence of interoperable digital standards. So the technology, systems, processes can't talk to each other, which means that information can't flow across the trading ecosystem. So Oswald's going to talk a little bit about that in the conversation. So those are the two barriers. You know, we started the year on in terms of legal reform, you know, effectively what we need is all governments now to sign up. There's an ICC call to action to all governments to now both reform their laws and modernize their laws, because the other problem here is that most of us are operating on antiquated legal systems. And in the UK, we know that goes back to the 1800s, but that's not uncommon elsewhere around the world. So we need to reform laws and we need to harmonize them to the the MLETR, as it's called, the UNCITRAL legal framework globally. We started the year with Singapore and Bahrain as fully reformed and fully harmonized, if you remember. Then Abu Dhabi came on stream. Sean's work at ITFA was instrumental to making that happen, which is great. We've since had two smaller economies coming on with Kiribati and Belize, and then we've got Paraguay coming through Parliament this year, so we're expecting them to also align later this year. And then the big commitment from the big economies has been this G7 ministerial commitment in the middle of the year, and the first country within the G7 will be the UK, coming on stream and aligning midway next year. But we're expecting the other G7 economies to follow suit pretty quickly. So the answer to your question is, yes, I was bullish in the spring. I'm even more bullish now because we're getting much more momentum. Watch out for the Commonwealth report. Niels will probably touch on, but what that will do is make the case across the 54 nations in the Commonwealth. And importantly, that includes the small and the large, the developed and the emerging markets. And we need that business case to make the case to governments all around the world. We can't just focus on the G7 alone. But you know, the goal number one has really been making the case for reform. I think we've made a big progress on that agenda. We'll end the year with business cases covering 60 economies. And now the case is all about scaling up the whole approach in 2022.
Great. And understand, as a follow-up to that, mentions there's 3 studies commissioned, one for the G7 as a whole, trade facilitation, digitization of customs documents, but also one on the UK impact and one on the Germany impact as a point of comparison, this idea of 2 sort of battlegrounds within trade digitization. Could you tell us a bit more about these sort of the collective findings of that, and maybe we could bring Rebecca in at some point on that also?
Yeah, I wouldn't call them battlegrounds. You know, at the end of the day, this is a collegiate effort. I think what we're trying to do here is shine a spotlight, because every country has a slight nuance to everyone else, right? We've all got our own legal histories. In the UK's case was kind of interesting because we did the business case early in the year, but we weren't able to go into more detail, as much detail as we wanted to. In the G7 report, by the way, there's a really killer fact in there that doesn't get quoted enough in my view, and that's the difference between paperless trade and then digitalization of the trade ecosystem. And if I can just quote those figures, if we just progress on the paperless trade, which is basically the digitization of customs documents, that will deliver 267 billion in additional exports by 2026. But if we digitalize the trade ecosystem, i.e. all trade documents, that delivers 6 trillion in additional exports by 2026. The difference is huge, but we've got to differentiate the two. And I think that came through in the G7 reports and has an important implication on the UK side. But one of the killer sort of statistics that came out of the UK report this time around was the use of digital identities. So we know that legal reform is a key pillar to progress. We know that standardization is also a key pillar to progress. But within standardization, if we're going to move to a system that's trustworthy, that's transparent, then we must have digital identities so we can track and trace and see goods and services, money and people moving through the system at any one time. And that, of course, solves issues around financial crime, amongst other things. And that, in the UK, we mapped out, what's the use of legal entity identification, it's called, another piece of jargon. And actually what we found is a really low coverage, 4%. So 4% of trading companies are using legal entity identification. So we've got a long way to go to get market coverage. And that 4%, by the way, are primarily in the finance sector who have to use legal entity identification because of financial regulation. So we've got quite a long way to go to spread that approach worldwide. That, by the way, is one of the global standards of the Digital Standards Initiative. Then in the Germans' case, they have a very specific problem. This is a lesson to us all, that legal reform alone isn't enough. In Germany's case, they do have existing laws that allow for the digitization of transport documents, but they don't have the laws in place for the rest of the documents that were required, title documents that are required. So they need to, one, put in place new laws to handle all trade documents, and 2, they need to provide directives and guidance to industry who are not implementing the laws because it's not clear how they stand in court. And that's a situation that we may all find ourselves in if we don't have clear guidance. It's really, really important that regulators have clear guidance, governments give clear guidance depending on their legal systems, and then the private sector and the market can implement the reforms, and then forwards we move. So that's the case in Germany. We wanted to be very specific on that. And we'll also be publishing, by the way, as part of that German report, a specific legal document aimed at government, setting out exactly what we think needs to be done for German industry.
It's very good. It's just as a quick sort of bit of housekeeping, I mentioned about Q&A. There's a chat function as part of the Q&A in the Zoom. So if anyone does have any questions, I see a few people have joined us, do pop them in there and we'll try and sort of get to them. And also, so we're trying to make this sort of free-flowing discussion. So if any of our panelists do want to jump in on any points, do sort of feel free to do so. As a quick sort of follow-up to you, Chris, before we go to some of the other members of the group, I guess in terms of those barriers that you mentioned, and this is an ongoing process, what are the sort of key barriers that have manifested themselves in the progress that's been made in the last 6 months? Is there anything that's sort of come down the line that was unforeseen, and you know, how has it fared in sort of negotiating those?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think, you know, there's growing awareness of this whole space. I think it's quite clear that you know, the issue of digitalization of title documents, electronic transferable records, as they're called, bills of exchange, bills of lading, you know, it's just fallen through the gaps. It's fallen out of scope of the customs work, digitization of customs document, and it's not being picked up by any other department across government. And that's a universal picture worldwide. So I think shining a spotlight on this area has really worked. And I think the business cases have definitely woken governments up to the opportunity. At the end of the day, this is you know, for every government now in very difficult financial or fiscal space where there isn't a lot of scope to spend a lot of money coming out of the back of COVID. This is a really low cost, high return activity to drive growth, right? You know, if you want to drive SME growth, financial inclusion. And I think governments are really waking up to that. So I don't see particular barriers. The only challenge ahead is to scale the whole approach up, and to also share lessons so that we can all learn from each other. We know what laws to change, what departments to go to, what the process is, how long it takes, and get on with the job. Focus on the big economies in particular, because if those don't move, then the rest can't benefit.
You mentioned about the business cases. Rebecca, if I can come to you, I know that Coriolis carried out some work on that. Is there anything you'd like to add in terms of your view on those cases? And before we go around the rest of the group, it'd be great to hear your views.
Yeah, I think the most important thing in this context is just the magnitude of the numbers. And you know, when we first ran those numbers, everybody said these numbers are too big. And then you look at the size of world trade and it's really big. So if you're looking at what type of proportion of change we can make once we start to digitalize everything, you're talking about a massive uplift in global trade. The other advantage with all of this, and I think it goes to the point that Chris was making, was that it hooks very readily into a process of legal reform and a policy agenda and action plan, particularly through the legal identifiers, actually. So one of the things that came out, and we've obviously conducted the business case work for the ICC, but also for the Commonwealth and also for the United Nations Development Programme. One of the really clear things that has come out in the Commonwealth and the UNDP work, which was across Africa, was the fact that we very much need to think about legal entity identifiers and regulations to enable legal entity identifiers and actually make those readily available, not just to corporates, but to individuals as well. So having some form of digital registration of individuals allows them to skip a lot of the manual processes and actually engage with the trade finance system in a way that then creates new markets. And this is some of the things that we're talking about. It's that we think there's a market there. We think that there's all of this trade that could be enabled, but a lot of the uplift is coming from the propensity to create new markets by enabling access to small and medium-sized companies around the world who currently don't get finance at all.
Yeah, I think the Africa stuff, we'll come to that later, because obviously we're also going to hear in terms of what's going on in the Commonwealth. So that's fantastic. Oswald, this seems like a good point to bring you in. The DSI was launched in 2020 with a similar goal of digitising trade. You've been involved in this report, worked with Chris. One of your big areas, I understand, is the challenge of facilitating technical interoperability among the many networks and platforms in the market. We've heard a lot about digital islands and many GTR pieces on this topic, and the need to form more of an ecosystem as reflected in the title for this session. But just how hard is it to connect these platforms and processes on a technical, legal and governance level?
Thank you. Thanks for that question. And Rebecca, just wonderful job on the report. And thanks, Chris, for your leadership in this space. It's a great question. So when I think about interoperability and I have a look at where we are today versus where we were about a year and a half ago, was the conversation has completely evolved. We hear a lot about the model law for electronic transferable records. We're starting to see the business cases. And I think this is it's required, it's necessary for us to actually enable this change at scale. When I think about the challenges, though, I think that from a technological point of view, integrating different systems is not something that's necessarily difficult. And what we've seen over the last year or two is some really great frameworks actually coming out to support that process. Sean is here. ITFA's D&I specification is one good example of that. Another good example is IMDA's Trade Trust. So these frameworks exist and people can use them to actually digitize trade beyond a single company or single fintech's borders. But I think when it comes to the actual challenges, the way in which I look at it is I think there's some hard blockers and there's some efficiency and effectiveness challenges that kind of go hand on hand. So let's take the easiest ones first. When it comes to the efficiency challenges, you can imagine that if you're going through multiple different platforms in a supply chain between yourself, your banks, your courier carriers, etc., you want to ensure that you're not translating legal entity identification, as an example, every single time on every single step, or that what you believe is an electronic bill of lading or what you've actually digitized with between the shipper and the carrier, again, doesn't have to translate as it moves throughout the supply chain, because these fundamentally just make it too expensive to scale. And we've seen that the scaling hasn't necessarily evolved beyond the 1 to 3%. So that's where standards are really impactful and powerful, because basically what they do is they show everyone that if you're digitizing processes, here's a legal entity identification standard, here's a verifiable credential standard, here's a standard for how to produce title documents, and it helps the efficiency, which ultimately addresses the effectiveness, which is fantastic. The challenge, though, is on the legal side, and this is where the work that people like Sean and Chris is doing is something that no single fintech or no single organization can do on their own. There's only so much that standard authorities can do. They can produce standards. There's only so much that individual businesses can do. They can adopt the standards, but what they can't do is they can't sign up every single company within their supply chain onto one private law contract that defines what a bill of lading is legally so that they can have liability coverage. And this is where the work that Sean and people like Chris are doing on the model law for electronic transferable record deployment is so important, because that's the one area that no matter how efficient we become in our processes, unless we solve that challenge, when the carrier gets to a port and they have to discharge cargo, it becomes a very practical conversation. Can I use this EBL? Yes or no? And can I actually use liability coverage? So I think the technology is easy. I think the standards are going to help make it even cheaper and more effective to do so. But I do think that the space that Chris just touched on, the legal side, that's the hard order bit, if you will.
And we've heard a lot about the benefits of these, globally accepted standards in creating this launch pad for what some have called a new era in trade finance. So the integration of those standards into operations needs to come from the banks and the vendors, presumably, and be translated into products and offerings for their customers. In your view, is the will there to achieve this? And if not, what more sort of needs to be done to get there?
Yeah, we've actually gone through a remarkable shift over the last 12 months. So when we think about this conversation, right, for the last, let's say 5 or so years, we've been trying to digitize trade, mostly banks with fintechs, trying to get a sense of how can they achieve this, with potentially the commodity industry really being one of the core front runners or the first enablers of that, purely because of the complexity of their supply chains not being massively complicated, and they're quite high margin businesses. What we've actually seen over the last, let's say 12 months, is that pool has expanded. It's no longer just the banks fundamentally working together on how to digitize the trade process, But you're seeing organizations like BIMCO, like DCSA, like FIATA stepping into the fold with all their members to say, how do we actually produce standards for electronic bills of lading, as an example, which is something we did not have 5 years ago. What we've also seen is this new era of frameworks that has come out, and ITFA again through DNI was one of the first that came through that, which was, instead of focusing on an individual fintech or an individual set of standards, how do we produce frameworks that actually help us all connect together? That's the second thing that I think is relatively new. And the final thing that I will add is what we've also seen is the business case change. It's no longer just about a collaborative platform between a shipper, carrier, and their customer. There's now modern use cases like fraud detection, like new ways of actually financing trade itself, automation, AI objectives, all of these now also coming into the fintech fold. I think the core challenge that we all need to focus on, in my view, in addition to the legal reforms, is actually advocating for this business case, not just at a governmental level, but actually in different industries. And the reason for that is, you can imagine if the market is still only 1 to 3% digitization, but we have so many more fintechs in this space, access to liquidity, if you're a fintech, is a little bit harder than what it used to be 5 years ago, right? And so what we all need to do, I think, as leaders in this space is help make the case for change, not just for governments, but actually for the different industry component parts. Yes, there's something in it for the carriers. Yes, there's something in it for the importers, and they can digitize it. So yes, I see a lot of momentum. I see a lot more people around the boardroom trying to solve this, and I think we still have a way to go to get us across the line.
This is a good chance to turn to Craig. And turning to you, Craig, I understand Huawei has been working very closely with the ICC and with various governments over the past several years to promote digital transformation, to build a stronger and more resilient global trade environment. And you're also sort of sponsors of this report. And it's been said that companies in sectors such as technology are very well placed to make these practical contributions in aiding this process, particularly a company the size of Huawei, of course, helping to create a more dynamic environment with particular benefit to SMEs. Based on what we've already heard from Chris and Oswald, are there any key observations you'd like to make as part of that?
Yeah, I'm going to pick up on a couple of points that Chris and Oswald have made in a moment. You're right, it's been a very long journey, and it's I've spent the whole of my career in the technology sector with Philips, Samsung, and Xerox, and now with Huawei. So the area that I look at is the ability of supply chains to deliver technology to as many people as possible, and for them to be able to make use of that through connectivity. Huawei is a company which is providing intelligent connectivity and cloud services, and moving also into the intelligent use of management of energy. But coming back to this point, when Huawei works with about 1,500 telecoms operators around the world, and over the years, it's been very clear to us that there is this legal fragmentation, which was referred to by Chris earlier. And when looking at that, we also, as a global company, and from my experiences with Philips, it's about how can we create supply chain efficiency. The savings in a supply chain are then gradually passed on to consumers, and so everyone benefits. So making those supply chains as efficient as possible is a good long-term objective. I mean, ICC is the sort of founding father by creating the Incoterms way back, I don't know, was it 100 years ago or 80 years ago? But those have provided fantastic harmonization in the use of terms across the world. But digital, so we're looking at how can digital help with making those supply chain efficiencies. And so how can we overcome this fragmentation? So what is clear, we see the benefits of global supply chains, and we think there should be more collaboration globally on new rules for the digital ecosystem, and the digital documents is one aspect of that. But it's very important that we have an inclusive approach in order to make sure that we arrive at convergence where necessary, such as the items that Oswald talked about, But where we don't have convergence, we should be pursuing the path towards coexistence and acknowledgement of the differences, and a form of coexistence and interoperability. Because ultimately, 50% of the jobs created by SMEs, I think they create 50% of all new jobs that are coming up in the world. So SMEs play a very important role. And I think there are many practical things that can help SMEs. And that's why we were very pleased to have the opportunity to sponsor the 3 business case reports in order to give some more deeper understanding of the cash benefits and financial benefits and timing benefits. And we've also been, I've always taken a role with SMEs. I've always thought at Philips, we have the idea that big companies do need to kind of help out where the SMEs don't lack, where they lack the organizations to contribute. So again, at Huawei, we have looked at what are the innovations which bring real practical benefits. And I think in the trade discourse, the discourse around digital trade for the last 5 or 6 years has been around a lot of concepts and a lot of, projections into the future of what might or might not happen. But of course, SMEs don't want to read that. SMEs want to know this will cut 35% and this will cut 80% off the timing. They want practical results. And I'm a very pragmatic person. And so I try to look for ways of bringing real benefits that when they hit the tarmac, it's real tangible changes. And so we've been pleased to do that. We've produced a paper in 2017 on digital trade, which contains a lot of information about the different applications of technology. And we updated it in 2021. Interestingly, we updated it during 2020 when COVID was breaking out. And so we redrafted some of that as well to look at digital FDI and how economies can attract investment into their countries. But it's also the message that we are seeing from experience on the ground is that for SMEs, there are a few small things. One is connectivity, one is access to technology, but also very important is access to skills and talent. And so we've also been working on that. I don't want to enlarge the discussion anymore at this moment, but clearly another big thing that's on our mind is to look for an intelligent way of viewing globalization and the next stages of it. Maybe I finished there because I want to give the opportunity for others as well. Otherwise, I'll talk too much. Jeff, back to you.
In terms of your point around sort of this idea of saving costs and helping SMEs internationalize is definitely a very interesting one. And obviously, with the supply chain challenges that we're also aware of, the sort of anything that can be done to encourage SMEs to internationalize, such as a more conducive environment, I think is a key point. But like, as you say, we might sort of risk getting waylaid on that point. I'd like to move to Sean now, who is obviously as chairman of ITFA, is here representing a wide cross-section of the trade finance market, and many of whom have this issue very close to their hearts. Now, Sean, I understand that at the returning in-person annual ITFA event in Bristol a couple of months ago, there was a really strong focus on the amendments being made to the legal infrastructure to help accelerate the use of digital trade documents. And as Chris mentioned, the UK being a number of countries which have moved forward on those reforms. Mm-hmm. And there was a presentation outlining a work in progress draft bill as well. Maybe you can tell us more details around that and the work with the Law Commission.
Yeah, sure, of course. Firstly, before I sort of get into detail, just a few general points. Thanks to the shout outs from Chris and Oswald. It is an area, trade digitization is huge. There is a Rome there at the end of the road. There's a lot of roads that lead to that, and this thing is happening on multiple levels. And the one we're talking about today is legal reform, and it's a foundational requirement. Absolutely, it's unfortunately the lawyers. I don't know what Craig thinks about this, but the lawyers often get pushed right to the end of the queue. And I do also do a lot of work in my job at SMBC on digitization. I'm on the board of a fintech, Congo, where there's actually some interesting things going on in relation to integrating some of the ITFA standards actually on transferable records on one of their platforms. So you have to come at this from multiple angles. You need the help of multiple associations, as Oswald has said, and it's not just the law. So what has happened, my experience has been the technology has moved very, very fast. And then you come to the end, you've got a fantastic platform and the banks say, whoops, I'm not sure this is going to get through our legal departments. I'm not sure that any of this actually is valid. And that's just on the quite basic offerings that we have at the moment. Now, when you move on to the sort of instruments that we are primarily interested with now, so the negotiable instruments, bills of lading, bills of exchange, promissory notes, those have an even more complex status, if you like, because they are negotiable, i.e. possession of that document gives you a right to goods or a right to have an unconditional claim on a particular person to pay you a sum of money at which you can trade. And this is the way, by the way, the forfeiting market started, 30, 40 years ago, when it was all pre-digitization. When people, I think this is an important point about standardization. When about 40 years ago, people said, well, how can I open up the emerging markets? Is there something there that I can understand? They alighted on the bill of exchange and the promissory note, because negotiable instruments and bills of lading as well, but sort of slightly secondary to that market, those for historical reasons, those instruments had spread around the world. And although, as Chris says, we're looking at a law from the 1880s in the UK, and in some cases much older, what you have to remember, firstly, that particular bill or act is often called the best drafted act on the statute book. And the reason it's such a good act, and the reason it's still relevant today, the reason you need to tweak it to deal with digitization, but you don't need to fundamentally reform it, is because it reflects the requirements of international trade, which, frankly, leaving aside the delivery channels, the fundamental needs have not changed for centuries, if millennia. But we definitely have to change those laws to take advantage of digitization. The basic legal issue is that if a thing needs to be possessed, most legal systems say it's got to be a real thing. It can't be a digital thing or a virtual thing, and that has been the problem. That's certainly the problem in the UK. Now, some of the more sort of virgin jurisdictions, you mentioned ADGM, and Chris kindly mentioned that ITFA was had a very active part in reforming the law there, which is a wholesale adoption of MLETR. What has happened there is that you can transpose the law in completely do a cut and paste, because there's nothing pre-existing. In other cases, you need to reform the law, and that's what's happening in the UK. Chris and I spent a lot of time with Sarah Green, who is the head of the UK Law Commission. When we had our well-attended conference, physical conference, only a few COVID casualties at the end. Unfortunately, none of the people who are on this call, and none of those serious. She set out where we are currently. It's really good news for the UK, and Chris knows probably more about this than me. But in terms of the legislative timetable, we're looking at late spring of next year. So when that happens, that's not just a change to English law. The real importance of English law is that it's used in a lot of trade documents around the world. And even if the physical trade has got nothing to do with the UK. So that's, and I know from a number of our members who are waiting for this to happen, to be able to commercialize their platforms, to be able to offer services that really make that they think make commercial sense, that have a viable market, which they can make money on. In our DNI initiative that Oswald mentioned, we talk a lot about this. We have a standard there for digital instruments, but we also did a workaround called the EPU, the Electronic Payment Undertaking. That's a workaround for how to deal with these instruments prior to the law being changed. That hasn't really been taken up very much, and the reason is that actually people are waiting for that change in the law. So really important that we do that. As I say, many roads leading to Rome, and many travelers on those roads. So it's all important that we do our bit on there. The other thing I'd just like to mention is about the other I. So we talk about interoperability. The other really important I, and again, I've seen this really from an upfront practical perspective, is integration. So I think somebody said, well, Oswald said that the technology is easy. There is a lot of technology out there actually in relation to transferable records within ITFA, through DNI. We have a number of vendors actually. And in fact, very importantly, maybe this is more to the point, we have a number of pure tech vendors who've integrated the transferable record, the digital original technology into their platform. So as part of their, as part of their wider trade tech offering, they can offer that as well. But the problem is really integrating, is banks, multiple banks integrating this, across in multiple countries. So not only have the legal problems, but you've got all the commercial problems. So the cost of doing this. So the standards are there. Well, the law has to be there. The standards have to be there for as Oswald has said on the bills of lading. Great work by DCSA, BIMCO, and FIATA. We've done work on the bill of exchange and the promissory note. And there's technology there to do it. So why isn't everybody just jumping into this? I mean, there is this point about the legal blocker, but that's going out the way, and people are looking at it. But then you've got to integrate this within bank systems, and banks have to be able to offer it and process it, connect it to their accounting systems and so on. That actually takes a bit longer. That requires investment, across multiple players. So that is, I think, that to me actually is a much bigger blocker now. 3 years ago, we hadn't even got to this foundational point. I mean, Chris and I used to go out to Geneva to speak to the WTO, to talk about Melita, didn't we, Chris? And we were sort of looked on as a little bit like cranks or nutters. Now it's mainstream. But we're now getting to the next problem, which is actually, can banks and even more so corporates actually integrate this? The technology is there, but that's the next step. So great work by all the associations, great work by Oswald in bringing all these efforts together. We're now on to the next stage, I think. But that's good. We've gone from one stage to the next. And here I'm being very optimistic that nobody in the UK Parliament decides that it's not a good law to pass. We don't think that's the case, as Chris said. It's really an uncontroversial act. It's low cost, big return. So there's no reason it shouldn't happen. We heard a few rumblings, but looks like those were just rumblings, and we should be in really good position, to change the law in the UK, and then that will flow out to the Commonwealth. It will flow out actually to the rest of the world, because, as I said, there is remarkable consistency across a lot of these instruments, whether you are an English law jurisdiction or not.
Fantastic.
Can I come in on that point? Yes, because I think you raise an interesting point about how to go about the implementation of this around the world, because obviously there are benefits, and these reports have targeted some big economies because and also they're coming out for the Commonwealth. The point of those reports is they're going to show for like big countries, small countries, that there are definitely huge benefits to obtain from this. It has a couple of potential the first point first is about how to translate that. If we can get the legal changes translated for the laws of England and Wales, that's one thing that's good. And you're right, a lot of the trade is based on these framework of instruments and bills of lading, promissory notes, and negotiable instruments, which are the backbone. And that's been a very good system. It's worked very, very well. But a lot of the implementation will be done locally. And you mentioned the Commonwealth, and I think that's very important, because changes that can be applied to England and laws of England and Wales, which are originating in London, these laws are quite often feature in the legal systems of the Commonwealth countries. Also looking at the laws, the trade laws, which are applied in France, they're a little bit different. They have the same backbone instrumental documents, but they are applied in France, and also, they're applied many times around the world in what you might call the Francosphere, which is the countries which have French as their leading language.
And through the Geneva
for
Convention as well. Yeah.
And for the Hispanosphere as well, you have the possibility of that distributing that to Latin America. My point is that I think it's not just because we have these big economies that have been studied, but it's also as a way of enabling these economies to take the lead and for them to make the legal changes in their appropriate languages, and for that to be translated, and for that to take it through the Francosphere, the Hispanosphere, and the Anglosphere. And I think that is the way of multiplying, which will make the difference, because we have to get this to a tipping point. As you said before, going to the WTO and talking to quite a few people, some of them think this is just too complicated, but we have to make it easy as well by looking at how to create multipliers. And I think these business cases are a good multiplier. They're getting awareness, and I think when the changes are made in the laws, they can be multiplied around the world quite easily. I say easily with some hesitation, because I'm sure the lawyers will take some time over the finesse of it. Sorry, that was my point. I just wanted to add that, Jeff.
Good, great. Now, actually, you beat me to the punch slightly there, Craig. I was actually going to bring Niels in here, who's actually representing the Commonwealth. So I think this is a fantastic sort of segue to that. And obviously representing an association of 54 independent countries, large and small, developed and developing. So there's a unique perspective. And Niels, thank you for your patience on this, and it's coming to you finally. You've been working on a project to quantify the impact of paperless trade across the Commonwealth. It'd be great to hear more about this and where it fits in with your broader digital agenda.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jeff, for that, and to everyone for the fantastic conversation so far. Many points made already are very much in line with our thinking. So Jeff, let me just contextualize that question with some background into why we're interested in this work. So the Commonwealth Connectivity Agenda was adopted by our heads of government in 2018 with a vision to increase intra-Commonwealth trade to $2 trillion by 2030. And we're working toward achieving this vision through 5 work streams, one of which, chaired by the ICC, focuses on business-to-business connectivity and provides a platform for engagement with the private sector on trade and investment issues. And now the role that digital plays in modernizing trade and investment is obviously one of our big focus areas. And through this private sector engagement came this discussion, as we're having today, around transitioning our economies to paperless trade and the legal reform necessary to increase acceptance of digital import and export documentation across the Commonwealth. And to your question, Jeff, the Commonwealth is a unique organization in the international arena, given the breadth and depth of our membership. As you mentioned, 54 member states, they span every continent. 32 of them are small states, including most of the world's small island developing states on the one hand, while on the other hand, our members also account for 1/4 of the G20 grouping of the world's largest economies. So this depth and breadth is very important as we discuss issues as we are today, such as legal reform, where unless we get a critical mass of countries involved, we won't be able to fully realize the potential gains. And as we hear, the conversation today is very much around achieving that critical mass, because the first step, as we see it, is to raise awareness of this issue and attempt to quantify the economic potential that is out there with these reforms for our member states. So it's in this way that we're working with Coriolis Technologies and with Rebecca to quantify this potential and to produce an economic illustration of the gains to be had, which will be in line with the work being done with the ICC in geographies like the G7, with the UNDP in Africa. And this means we'll have collectively a large comparable data set to push for large-scale global action in these areas. And on our part, we'll be taking these numbers to our next heads of government meeting in 2022 to galvanize action across our membership. And Jeff, I'll just conclude on that last point, because there's this high hope and optimism that this will be received positively. And indeed, as was mentioned already, many Commonwealth countries have been amongst the early movers when it comes to legal reform, whether in Belize, in Singapore, in Kiribati, in the UK. And this is important, as Sean was just mentioning, that that common histories and legislative practices, mean many Commonwealth country legal systems are based on English common law. Many contracts in international trade are written using English common law. So legal reform across the Commonwealth when it comes to paperless trade, it can quickly snowball with massive scale potential. And the last thing I'll say is that this diversity amongst these early movers, goes to show that factors like economic size or level of development or geography are not impediments to action.
On the subject of the Commonwealth, thank you, Niels. I guess one market often featured in these discussions, and a market that's close to our hearts at GTR, is that of Africa. And we were hoping that representatives from UNDP and Africa Investor were going to be able to make this call, but sadly not. They've been, with the levels of intra-African trade seen as painfully low in many ways, obviously, despite the hopes of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. What more can be done to improve this? And Rebecca, coming back to you, I know you've been working with the UNDP and also with Africa Investor on some interesting projects. Can you share more detail in their absence?
Yes, of course. And we have had emails from the UNDP this morning. Ironically, they are having serious connectivity issues. And I guess from that point of view, it raises the big problem for Africa and intra-African trade, that we're starting from a very different base point. So African trade is completely different, say, for example, to Singapore trade or UK trade or German trade, insofar as it's very dependent on commodities. There's a huge commodity reliance even within intra-African trade. And the problem that the UNDP is trying to solve is how to wake up heads of state across Africa and work with the African Continent Free Trade Area on a digital agenda. So the work that the UNDP and Africa Investor have been working on is simply to provide some kind of a wake-up call. So it's broader trade facilitation, which, to the point that Chris was making right at the beginning, the point for Africa is that there's a role for all of this digital agenda within trade facilitation to start with. So bringing more companies into the formal economy from the informal economy, addressing the intra-African logistical challenges, infrastructural challenges, and also a very big inclusivity and ESG agenda as well. So the work that we've been doing has focused to a very large extent on a broader trade facilitation agenda rather than simply digitization, because from the perspective that the African continent is starting at, the trade facilitation inclusivity within that trade facilitation is more important. And one of the pieces of just background during the COVID pandemic, they're estimating that the African economy as a whole has gone into recession for the first time in 20 odd years, and that you've got a very large number of people who've been pushed into poverty. Food security is an issue. So a lot of these things within an African context are important. But what I would say, the biggest thing that we had to address, and that the African Continent Free Trade Area has been keen to address, is this costs issue. Now, Craig mentioned it, Chris has mentioned it, Oz has mentioned it, Niels has mentioned it, Sean. Everybody knows that the costs for trading are very important, because, if you look at this from the demand side, in other words, the SMEs who are involved in all of this, it's the costs of trading that make intra-African trade prohibitive. So, one of the pieces of analysis that we did for the Commonwealth and for the UN is looking at that cost base. And in some countries in Africa and parts of the Commonwealth as well, the costs are more than 100% of the trade revenues that companies can expect to receive. So that makes trade actually prohibitive. It means that an SME can only trade in the informal economy, can only trade out of the system because those costs of actually doing it properly are so high. And a lot of that comes from the informal aspects of cross-border crossings. So, I mean, in terms of where we take this, it's about waking up the policymakers, heads of state in particular, getting them to connect with the structures and systems that exist in the AFCFTA, so the African Continent Free Trade Area, working within the economic regions to work with the African Continent Free Trade Area, developing the platforms, single windows, and so on and so forth, before a lot of the bigger questions around digitization can be implemented as well. But I would say one thing, I mean, Rome wasn't built in a day, to keep using the classical analogy that we've all been using. It's going to take some time to build. But there is a political willingness that's evident in the public discourse. So there's a lot of acceptance out there amongst small businesses and amongst people who are supporting the African continent to get to the point where this is all enabled. And I guess what I would say, just in conclusion on all of this, is that because the technology is there, and because there's a perception that businesses and banks can jump from sort of steam manual methods straight to digital methods, actually the size of the prize is huge, and enabling all of that trade could mean a very rapid acceleration if everything can be hooked together very quickly. So it's all about using the legal structures that the AFCFTA has already set up and implementing those across each of the African countries.
Fantastic. We've got just under 10 minutes left, so I thought this would be the opportunity. We've got a few comments that have been posted and questions coming in, some from the audience as well. If you've not had a chance to post any questions, do so in the chat and we'll try and get round to it. And we did promise a free-flowing dialogue, so this is the chance for sort of additional comments and any other business from, obviously quite a large group. I want to pick up on one question we've got in from Lionel Taylor here, talking about the idea of education. This actually feeds back to we at GTI had a quick plug here, had an Africa event in London last week, which was a hybrid, talking with African financiers from the UK, but also based in Africa, dialing in. One of the conversations around digitization was this idea of education. You've got local and regional banks who don't have the bandwidth to develop their digitization plans for trade, sitting on the sidelines, as Lionel suggests, quite literally confused as to what they should be doing. And Oswald, you made that sort of point as well in terms of the education, and you don't want this idea of a sort of two-speed in terms of growth in the market. What more do you think can be done to improve that understanding, particularly in these emerging markets, whether it's Africa, the wider Commonwealth, or indeed, anywhere not from the OECD potentially?
Yeah, it's quite an important point, and it's equally as true for banks as it is for carriers, as it is for shippers, etc. If I'm a carrier and I see there's an EBL standard from DCSA, how do I learn how to practically leverage that? If I see the ITFA D&I specification and I want to go onto a course, let me go onto that course and learn how to digitize my document using my own. So I think to the point that Sean made earlier is we're going through an evolutionary process. And I think for us to get to a point now where we're moving from 10 to 100 people that are actively digitizing to thousands, hundreds of thousands, it's going to be, how do we enable people who we don't know, who don't have access to us, to go on training and leverage the standards within their context and adopt them and digitize their process without the fear of what they are busy learning is not going to be compatible with someone else down the line. And the final point I'll make, because we are low on time, is I also think this is where multilateral banks can also play a role, is how do we seed this education? How do we seed this digitization of infrastructure into some of these regions, modernize the ports, modernize the customs agencies, and ultimately get the standards adopted? Anyway, that's it from me.
Chris, I think you'd like to come in on this one as well.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point. If you remember going back to the original digital trade roadmap, there were 3 pillars there. Pillar 1, legal reform; Pillar 2, standardization; Pillar 3 was around adoption, and that Pillar 3 is all around education and adoption. So I think there's 2 aspects of it. Oswald's just touched on. One is getting scale, getting the critical mass Yeah, and that's obviously where our main focus. If you can get traction in G20, G7, Commonwealth, across governments, trade corridors is another important aspect of that. Then you can start to shift the market. But there's no question at all that we're going to have to really get into the detail with sectors. If you talk to people like the Warehousing Association sector or the warehousing sector, it's full of SMEs, lots of out-of-date technology system or no technology whatsoever. It's all paper-based. We have to sit down with them and get into processes and systems, making the business case for investment to get the right technology solutions. So it's a massive opportunity for technology providers, but it's also a huge opportunity for each of the sectors. But every sector is slightly different. Every sector is going to need its own business case. And we're going to have to walk along that road with everybody to move everyone at scale globally, not just on national level, to make sure that we actually shift the market wholesale.
Probably got time for a couple more questions. I guess we obviously want to go beyond too much the hour we've got allocated. One point that was made in the comments earlier was this idea of political will and discourse. Now, as we know, we live in a world where political will and discourse is quite full of tension at the moment. But is the general consensus that there is political agenda to drive this growth, and that this is something that's being carried through in a positive way? I know, Chris, you've been very instrumental in the APPG, should I say, the government group, to discuss these things. Maybe a bit of an update on that. And I guess, Rebecca, from your side, from the geopolitical, be keen to hear what you think as well. But kicking off with you, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question at all, I think, that one of the reasons we're seeing traction from governments on this agenda is, one, it's not political. You can see from COP, from G7, we're going to see it again at the WTO Ministerial Conference, that there is a real problem at political level of getting consensus from very divergent views on the big political issues. And some of that is digital, the movement of data, management of the digital economy. There's just a difference of opinion and approach, and that all needs facilitating and brokerage over the next few years. But on this space, it's very practical. To Craig's point, you can actually make a terrific difference to SME growth, to bring in more companies into the system in terms of financial inclusion, more access to trade finance to underpin growth. And you can do that at almost zero cost. So governments are not unalert to that fact. And it's not a political issue. It's just actually a very practical issue. It's just about modernizing the existing trade system. That's all we're really talking about. So it's technical, and we've got to educate and raise awareness and talk governments through what they need to do. But there's no real political argument against it. And the business cases have been fundamental in making that a reality, because suddenly the economic value, it speaks for itself.
Well, I think I'd add to that just very quickly, because I'm aware Craig wants to come in as well, but very quickly I'd add to that and say, if you look at the public discourse, and what you're doing is you're looking at how this is reported in the media. So you're not necessarily looking at the political will, you're looking at the public acceptance of the process of digitization and how much users are actually interested in using digital technologies in order to enable trade. So we've done that piece of analysis, and it's been really striking how 2021 year to date is there's been a huge amount more reporting of it in the latest year than there has in the previous years, in the previous 5 years. So it's something that's really gathering momentum. And I guess what I would say is politicians have one thing in common anywhere in the world. They all like being popular, and they all like having votes. So if you run a discourse analysis that says, actually, there's a public will there, then they will do things without it being necessarily political with a big P, in order to make sure that the public discourse is matched with actions. So I think that in and for itself shows that there is a momentum that is in the public that will eventually feed through into politics.
I think I heard a great quote last week: is politicians all know the right thing to do, they're just not sure how to do it and also get re-elected. So that's maybe an interesting sort of analogy there. Craig, you had a point to make.
Well, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points that were made there. Rebecca has correctly pointed out that costs for SMEs are disproportionately prohibitive for them. So it can really make the difference between an SME remaining remaining in this national market or becoming an international company with better connectivity and digitalization. It can really make a difference. There's some great work done by the OECD a few years ago where they said a 10% increase in connectivity translates into a 2% increase in goods trade and 3% increase in services trade. And if you're inside a free trade agreement, you get an extra 1% on top of that. So, I mean, that's good growth for many economies, and that needs to be tapped. But if SMEs can't tap into that, then they're missing a great opportunity. And I think digitalization of documents and processes is a really good way of helping them to create the jobs and create the economic recovery. Now, very quick point on the digital divide. When we started to move on to digital divide, there is so important that the supply chains that have shifted to Southeast Asia from the US and from the EU, they were all driven by demand in the EU and US for digital devices. But all that manufacturing is now in Southeast Asia. It's really important that those supply chains are connected so they can deliver technology for all. That's something that we talk about, how to get people the technology, the devices they need in order to connect. And it's so important for skills and talent. I have in Southeast Asia, there have been 2 webinars last month on digitalization of trade in Southeast Asia. And that was part of an initiative to raise awareness. So you're right, raising the awareness is going ahead. There's some great examples in Southeast Asia. Singapore's been mentioned. Singapore is all digital ID all the ID is digital, and setting up a company, you can do it online. So, I mean, there are some countries going at faster speeds than others in digitalization, but everybody can get an advantage if there is a digitalization of the trade documents. And also with respect to startups, the Huawei in Southeast Asia is earmarked, we've earmarked $100 million to help startups in the region to develop their businesses. And this, again, this is a great benefit to them. I think the initiative is wonderful, and I would love to continue supporting it.
I know we're a couple of minutes over. I would like a couple of final comments from Niels and then from Sean before we wrap up. Niels, perhaps you go first.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Jeff. So I guess to wrap up, my final point will probably be around this question of political will, because these reforms we're talking about today, they don't require fiscal effort, which is crucial at a time when there's limited fiscal space that is needed elsewhere in the post-COVID recovery. They don't require new technology, as there's already the technology there in the private sector. So the question of why they haven't happened yet, we believe comes down to this issue of political will and perhaps a lack of awareness of the gains to be had. So hopefully with this quantitative evidence, we can provide the impetus that is needed for widespread reform across the Commonwealth. And Chris, to your point in the chat there, next year, our heads of government meeting will be an ideal platform for us to get the word out more broadly. Thanks, Jeff. And
Sean?
Yeah, so look, I think it all seems that it's easy politically. It takes time. I think the real issue is that once you've got over this foundational point, are there going to be sufficient adopters of the technology? And that's really the issue here. And you do need pioneers for that. And I've maybe because it's not my own money, I always say that the big banks actually should be investing a lot in the digital platforms, because it's not going to benefit just them, and that of course is the problem. You've got this sort of this freeloader issue, but actually that's completely wrong way of looking at it. In my view, certainly on the platforms that I spent a lot of time working on, you do need to bring in much smaller banks. You need to make it easy for them. In some cases, you even need to subsidize them, but you need to build, because the other, we talked about the 2 I's, the N word is network. Right? We need the network. That network only happens when you've got interoperable standards, when you've got integration, but when you've got the scale of people using that. And there are on the legal side, there are pioneers. There are pioneers of scale, or in fact important regional pioneers, such as ADGM, which is not a big country but is important regionally. We've got Singapore, which is important regionally. We started working, another huge region is, of course, the EU. And we've started working with them to try and actually change the law. There seems to be possibly a good route to legal change, but they don't actually understand the problem. And in fact, Chris, hopefully will be joining forces with us on that, but we have meetings set up with, hopefully will be set up with the head of DG Trade. So it's finding its scale. You're always going to have a cadre of people. Some of those are the political cadre, others are the commercial, the banking, and the corporate cadre. I did a panel on Cybos 3-4 weeks ago. BHP were on there, super keen on digitization, but they're a huge company. Those SMEs are not. They really do. Sometimes you really do need to lead the horse to water.
I think that's a great point to finish with. I know we're over time, but hopefully everyone's found the benefits of being. So I'll bring this all to an end. No, thank you to our speakers for sharing their insights, and indeed to you, our viewers, for tuning in and making your comments, posting questions. Hope we're able to address everything. Apologies if we weren't able to do so. I think we can say with confidence this issue isn't going anywhere. As I'm sure you'll already know, all the content from this week is being made available to view on demand via the Coriolis website, and the team will get back to you more details on that. You can catch up with anything. And we're only day 2. There's a full week and a very impressive program. I should also get in trouble if I didn't say my colleague Eleanor Ragg is moderating a session this afternoon, which is going to be all around ESG and digital. There's a number of other working lunches, fireside chats, some really great stuff throughout the course of the week. So lots of conclusions I'm sure we can draw. But in the meantime, on behalf of Rebecca and the Coriolis team, many thanks for joining us. Take care, and we'll see you all next time.